everyone.
Hello.
Ah, hello.
All right. Okay, so what we want to do is go ahead and orient people to the platform here. And if folks are on the line, if you could please mute your line for us. 1 second. Okay, if I have muted your line, please don't unmute it right now, so that we are hearing a lot of background noise, especially from those of you who sound like you're in a city. So if we could go ahead and keep our lines muted, we'll let you know when it's time to unmute. Okay. All right, so here we go. So the first thing we wanted to do was make sure that folks had an idea about how the Zoom platform works. Some people are still new to this process. So if you're just now joining Zoom for the first time, a little brief orientation. If you look at your screen in the bottom lower left-hand corner, what you'll find are two icons. One you'll see has the unmute or mute sign. That will allow you to mute or unmute your line directly from the platform. To the right of the mute sign, you'll see the stop or start video. That will allow you to turn on your video camera when we move to the discussion section of the webinar. Further to the right, you'll also see icons related to the participants. This will allow you to see who else is on the webinar. And then there's also the chat room. That will actually light up and blink when there are messages in the chat room. So if you would like to be using the chat room function, you can go ahead and highlight that so that you can see it during the webinar, or use it to interact with other members of the BHIP team or ask questions. If anyone has any questions about how the Zoom platform works during the webinar, please feel free to use the chat room function, and I would invite my BHIP team to help me out a little bit and support you with any of the technical problems you may have. So what we'd like to do now is do a little practice with our platform here by asking everyone to introduce themselves using the chat room. So what we want you to do is, in the chat room, identify yourself with your name and your agency. And if you have multiple people at your location, please be sure to let us know everyone is in attendance. And I see Lori also put a great comment in the chat room, which is, if you have a video camera, we would love to go ahead and be able to see you on camera, especially to the site that I know we bought cameras for, so I know we sent them to you. So don't make us call you out. So for folks who've done that already, please continue to introduce yourself in the chat room. We do use that for evaluation purposes as a way to have a virtual sign-in sheet. So also for the BHIP team, if you could look through our tiles and see if there's anyone who hasn't introduced themselves in the chat room, and be sure to record those names as well. When we look at the objectives for our program today, what we want to do is introduce the model for improvement as a method to accelerate system change. We want to explain how the plan, do, study, act cycle is a method to test this change, and then apply that model for improvement to the PHQ-9 screening integration example, so that you can see in real world how this might work out in your site. Then we want to introduce a concept called measurement trees as a way to help drive your project and as a way to measure your PDSA cycles, and then explain how this step measurement relates back to your quality improvement project. Our agenda for today, we had our welcome. We'll move into the model for improvement, then measurement trees, and we've left about 20 minutes at the end, maybe a little bit more, for the discussion section, so that we can really walk through any questions you may have related to how these ideas and these models may apply in your environment. Then we'll close, and we have a brief evaluation that will give you the link, or we're so technological now, we have QR codes. I don't even know how that works, but there are people on the team that do, and they have figured it out for us. So we'll be able to have you evaluate using multiple methods. So we wanted to begin first by looking at how change very broadly happens. This is actually from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, and when you look at their model for improvement, it really begins by having an infrastructure for change around it. And there are multiple methodologies to apply change to systems. Probably in your organizations, you have a method that you use to change. Some of you may not have a system that uses a specific methodology, but you've probably walked through some of the same steps leading towards your quality improvement project. When you look at change, regardless, 1 second, if folks are in the background, we can hear you. If you could go ahead and if my team members, BHIP team members, if you could identify who that is and let me know so that we could mute that line. Okay, thank you very much. All right, as folks are going through, just know that if you have background noise, it makes it almost impossible for us to hear on the webinar. So if you're joining and you hear it in your background, we're likely to hear it in ours. So go ahead and please use the mute function. If you have any questions about how to mute your line, you can ask that in the chat room, and one of the BHIP team members will be able to help you. So returning back to the slide, one of the ways we wanted to start out was by identifying how change broadly happens, regardless of what system you may be working in or what change methodology your quality improvement team or committee may use at your institution. Most processes begin by forming the team. Once you form the team, that team comes together, starts looking at the problem, identifying what work needs to be happening, what projects need to take place in order to achieve the goals, and they begin setting aims, really guiding the project forward. After setting aims, projects move to establishing measures, making sure that they know that what they're doing is actually improving a process on the back end. Once you've established the measurement system, these change methodologies move into selecting changes, testing those changes, lastly implementing, and then spreading across the system. So no matter how you're changing, these steps are probably going to be your broad framework, and they've been the framework that we've used here in the BHIP project. So far, as you've seen, almost all of the sites have completed these steps in the change process. All of you have formed your teams. All of you have set your aims. You have established the BHIP measures and have begun reporting those. And now you've been in the process of selecting and testing your change ideas, which is why we have our deadline of January 1st for the first PDSA cycle. And this webinar is meant to help set you up for that process. So I am a child of the 80s. I grew up on movies like The Never Ending Story, I think, which is why a lot of us have childhood trauma, because we all wish that we could save Artex in the swamp of sadness. But what we realized that movie taught us is that you can't pull Artex out of the swamp of sadness, right? Spoiler alert, he loses the horse every time. And so what we learned from this is that you can't pull people to a process. Right? If people want to stay where they are, they're going to stay right there. And so when people go in to implement change, a lot of times it's like Atreyu dragging Artex out of the sea of sadness. It just doesn't work. The organization wasn't prepared for the change. They didn't understand how not to get stuck in the sadness. And this is a narrative that we find in a lot of healthcare organizations. There were bad change that took place that people weren't prepared for, that systems that change ended up in, meaning everybody got fired. So when you come in and say, hey, we want to change the environment, people rightfully get nervous, they get scared, they hunker down, and they start protecting their jobs because they don't know what's going to happen. So a way that you can help organizations march through what is good change is preparing them for what's happening, that you're not pulling an organization out of their own sort of hopelessness, but rather never drawing them into the sea of sadness in the first place. Because what you've done in advance of a change is you have made sure that that is a good change, that it's one that's acceptable to the people that you're asking to change, and that on the back end, what you do actually yields improvement. Because there's nothing worse than doing a lot of work on something, and then at the end of the day, not being able to show that anything that you did mattered, or worse, having everybody so upset about all of the change that nobody wants to participate in change again. So how do we get Artex out of this sea of sadness? And I think the way you do that is you test the change that you're trying to do, right? You make sure that this is the right thing. When you go in to test your change, and again, this is from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, test of change will help you increase the belief that your change will actually result in improvement. It will help you decide which of several change ideas might actually lead to that improvement. When you think back to your brainstorming and your driver diagrams, all of those ideas that you came up with, you want to test those to find out which are the really good ones before you go and implement across some of your sites, which are very large healthcare systems. You can also help evaluate how much improvement can be expected from a change. Are you going to see a big bump, or is it a little bump over time? And how long will that take? You can decide whether the proposed change will actually work in the environment you want it to work in. Sometimes we can design a beautiful process sitting at a table, but when you get into a clinic and it's got a flow, it doesn't work, right? Well, if you had never tested that, but sent out all the instructions across the hospital system, you could see the chaos that would ensue when it didn't work in the environment it was intended to. You can decide which combinations of change will have the desired effect on the important measures of quality. So it's sometimes not just one change, but maybe a series of small changes that might lead to your outcome. And these tests will allow you to identify what things work together and move you forward versus what things might drag another project down or what might be a longer term vision goal that isn't really something that can be tested in this small cycle. And then how do we move the project down into that space so that what you're actually doing is affecting change at the level of the system that you need to be effective. It can also help you evaluate the cost and the impact and the side effects of your proposed change. If you think back to our last learning session when we did the butterfly effect, where we demonstrated how any small movement in a chain of events can actually cause massive variation on the other side. We don't want you going in and just blowing up your systems and your flow without having first thought about how does this affect things downstream. And then lastly, and I think the most important part of it, it minimizes your resistance to change upon implementation. If you have champions inside your organization who have already tested the process, who are already bought in and think this is a good idea, then those folks can carry that message back to their peers. This is especially critical when you're trying to get and change physician or prescriber behavior. Often those folks are seeing patients all day, and so they may be somewhat disconnected from the system that's changing how they do their work. If you don't have people who are in that job willing to stand up and vouch for your process, you may face a lot of resistance from folks because they don't know if this is good change. So the way that we are going to propose you go about this is by using something called the Model for Improvement. The Model for Improvement was developed by Associates in Process Improvement, API. You can find them online, see some of their resources. But the whole point of this was to accelerate improvement by using small tests of change. This model is broadly used across industries for quality improvement, especially outside of healthcare. A lot of our quality stuff actually comes from manufacturing. But when you look at this, the reason you find it in so many spaces is because it's a really simple process, yet it's very robust. You can really affect a lot of change down the road by actually testing very small things. What we also like about this model is that it is not intended to supplant your already existing change methodology. So if you're in a clinic or an organization that's potentially implementing a lean methodology, the Model for Improvement can work like a gear on your machine and just make it go a little faster. So it should not conflict with what you're already doing, but rather support it. The other reason we chose the Model for Improvement is that this model has been used in New Jersey as well as the Ryan White program for over 10 years. It's the dominant model in the National Quality Center, now the Center for Quality Improvement and Innovation. And it's also been the dominant model used in the New Jersey HIV Cross-Part Care Collaborative. When you look at the other reason we chose it is because it's one that most of the parts in New Jersey are pretty familiar with. So what is the Model for Improvement? The Model for Improvement is essentially beginning with 3 questions. What are we trying to accomplish? How will we know that the change is an improvement? And what changes can we make that will result in improvement? And out of that third question, what changes can we make? This is always a critical point. How can we change? What are we going to do? And how do we know that change will result in improvement? Well, we do that by implementing PDSA cycles. Plan, do, study, act. When you look at the PDSA cycle, let's break it down step by step. In the plan phase, what you want to do is plan the test of change that you're looking at, including a plan for a collection of your data. Your plan should state the objective of the test. What are you trying to do here? And this is a moment where we'll say to people, you don't got to get fancy, right? Think really basic. Keep it simple. What are you trying to do? You want to make predictions about what will happen and why. if I do this thing that I think I can do, what will happen on the back end? How will I know in my data this is going to work? And then you want to develop a plan to test that change. Who's going to do it? What are they going to do? When is it going to happen? Where will the test of change occur? And what data need to be collected during that test in order for you to evaluate later whether it was effective? When you move into the do phase, this is trying out your test on a very small scale. And when I say small scale, we potentially mean one patient on one day with one provider, just to see if it worked. How was the experience? You want to carry out the test. You want to document any problems or unexpected observations, especially those of you working in any sort of database or electronic health record. You already know that when you go in there and touch a button, it affects 20 other buttons. So you want to make sure that you know what happens when you push the button. And sometimes you only find out when you do it. And then chaos, or if we're lucky, beauty, right? Well, this is why we want to test this change, because we want you to end up in more beautiful places and less chaotic places. When you're in the do phase, you also want to begin the analysis of your data. There's no need to wait, months down the road for 7 months of data to see whether or not what happened on one day with one patient and one provider worked. You can drop in and have that conversation, most likely on the same day. Once you had your test of change, then you have your study phase. And this is where you want to set aside the time to analyze your data and study the results of your test. You complete the analysis because remember, in the do phase, you probably started looking at it. You want to come to your conclusion. You want to compare your data back to your predictions, summarize, and reflect what was learned. Were your predictions true? Did what you think was going to happen happen? Did something else happen? And if so, what was that thing that occurred? Because after you have your study phase, what you then want to move into is the act phase. And in the act phase, you refine the change based on what was learned from the test. So if you speak, let's say you're implementing a new form and you speak to the provider and they say, wow, I really wanted question 5 to be question 2. That would have made a lot more sense in the way I was doing my job. Then you would make that change, move question 5 back to question 2, and prepare a plan for the next test. Because now you want to test that form again with one patient, with one provider, to make sure that the change that you just made was a good change. When you look at how PDSA cycles link together, you want to have multiple cycles of change around one change idea. So when you look at this, in the example we were just talking about, the form, you would test it with one patient, right? That's your first cycle, cycle 1A. And then after you've had that test of change, you would drop back with your team and make whatever revisions to the tool needed to be made. Then you go back in and you increase your test to 3 patients. Maybe you have a little bit more confidence in your tool this time because you've already had a test of change and you think you might almost be there. So you're going to spread the tool across a couple other people in order to boost your data. So then when you get to cycle 1D, you're revising again, taking the experience from the first cycle, your first revision, and now your second cycle, and make any further revisions as needed. Then you get to your implement and monitor. Once you've gone through your PDSA cycles, these could be 1 cycle of revision, it could be 5 cycles of revision. It really depends on what happens in your test of change. But you constantly want to keep moving forward. That's the idea. You don't want to get stuck and get yourself in this like, oh, we go through cycle 1 the first Monday of every month. That's not a good way to approach this kind of change. You want the rhythm of the project to drive you forward. And when you get to your cycle 1E, your implement and monitor, that's when you also should be thinking about things like, how will we sustain this change that we just made, right? Lori put a great in the comment in the chat room, the rhythm of the project, right? You got to let the rhythm of the project drive your PDSA cycles. The other thing that's important to know about PDSA cycles is that they can be happening at the same time. Now, everyone bear with me here, because in the past, this seems like it could be incredibly overwhelming. Oh my gosh, Adam, this is like 6 QI projects at once. No, that is not what we are asking you to do. What we are asking you to do is look at all the components within your change ideas and see where things are linked to one another that could be happening concurrently. For example, what you see here are actually the steps in the chronic care model, from self-management support the delivery system change, decision support, clinical information, community resources, and leadership. You could look at all of these domains and potentially have a tiny little change that needs to take place in each of these spaces in order for you to get your change through. You want to be able to link these PDSA cycles potentially together so that you can leverage all of that work at once around a change idea or multiple change ideas. But if your PDSA cycles are too big, then this process will be very complicated. That's why the focus of the PDSA cycle is to think about a really small change and be incremental about it, so that as you're moving through your PDSA cycles, making your change, you're not doing so much that it becomes overwhelming or too hard to track. So let's take a look at an example about how this might work. So we've asked all of the sites to integrate the PHQ-9 screening into their systems if they hadn't already done so. So a lot of the sites have been walking through this process. We've seen how all of you have approached it. And we thought this would be a great way to walk you through how the model for improvement applies to this space.
It's going to be too loud.
Before we begin, I hear some folks. You can go ahead and mute your line.
Adam, it's Tiara line.
Okay, one second. Let me find it.
I think she muted herself. Yeah, she did.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so let's take a look again at how the PHQ-9 integration example can be applied. So when looking at the model for improvement, again, let's remember we're talking about 3 questions. What are we trying to accomplish? How will we know that the change is an improvement? And what changes can we make that will result in improvement? And those changes will be tested in our PDSA cycle. So what are we trying to accomplish? So the first question is actually pretty easy to answer and one that should be shared across most of the projects at some point, which is we want to screen all of our patients with the PHQ-9 tool. And then the second question, how will we know that the change is an improvement? This is where the BHIP measures come into play. We have given you the data sources that you will need to be able to demonstrate that your change is an improvement. So this is the measure, BHIP screening measure 1, the percentage of patients aged 18 years and older with a diagnosis of HIV screened for clinical depression in the measurement period using the PHQ-9 standardized depression screening tool. So because this is across all sites, everyone will be playing in this space in some way or another. So by using this measure, it allows us to track progress across the state and show how these measures and these projects lift and move the needle at the statewide level. So what changes can we make that will result in an improvement? So for this example, let's look at a specific change idea, which is to change the patient visit flow to integrate the PHQ-9 screening. When you sit down and you come up with this change idea, this is an example of what a PDSA cycle may look like. So the plan is to change the patient visit flow to integrate the PHQ-9 screening tool. In the do phase, we're going to first review the current patient visit flow and process for depression screening. Second, revise the current patient visit flow to integrate the PHQ-9 screening. 3, identify and train the provider and team to test the integrated visit. And lastly, test that integrated visit with one provider for 1 day. In the study phase, you want to meet with that provider and team and discuss their experience with that integrated flow. And you want to gather feedback on how they think you might be able to improve this new integrated visit flow. In the act phase, you want to revise that integrated patient visit flow and retest again with an additional provider. Or, if ready, you can adopt the process. Now, when you look at this example of a PDSA cycle, I'm sure people are going, but wait, how did you know what to ask and when? And how long is it going to take? And when did you train the providers? And who knew what to do? Those are great questions and additional PDSA cycles that should build off of your change idea. That's what we're going to constantly push you as coaches to actually think smaller. We want you to take more time, make the change more biteable, right? You want to bite off what you can chew. And right now, sometimes we bite off the whole cow and it's like we're carrying a farm around, right? We got to get something that we can actually work with.
I think it's start video, right?
So when you look at lots of changes, as I said before, you might end up, when you go to change your PHQ-9 process, you may need to develop a system to track that PHQ-9 screening performance. I know a lot of sites have been engaged in building their systems to be able to track and measure the performance data. And I would give a giant shout out to the community-based organization cohort who all submitted their data. And a thank you to everyone else who did as well, because that's really the first step, right? I see everyone high five it. Yeah. Sorry, I'm showing favorites. All the other cohorts, we love you. You're doing a great job. The other thing that you may do when you're looking at this process is you got to train the staff on how to use the PHQ-9 screening tool. Some of our sites actually came forward and said, hey, you know, we actually do this already, but what we've noticed is we're not sure if we're doing it the best way. We think maybe it's competency in our staff. Could you train them to ask the questions better? Absolutely. We have PDSA cycles right now going on in the state doing just that. So before, right, you can see how this works. You can determine a referral process for positive screens. I know our partners at some of our clinics are actually looking right at this. I know IDP is really looking at their referral process. It's like how to shore up that shit there and kind of really solve the gap in what we can see. You could also change the new patient intake, right? We've talked a lot about established patients. We have this whole other bucket of new patients that if you say you're going to screen everybody with the PHQ-9, you got to think about that, a whole nother series. And you could also review all your assessment and reassessment procedures and make sure that you're not duplicating things. What's important to know about all of this is that this is one component we just looked at to change the visit flow. However, each one of these change ideas could be multiple PDSA cycles building on one another. So sometimes people, they come to us and they say, but Adam, it doesn't seem like we're doing too much work. That's when you're doing the right work, right? Because it's small enough that you can bite it off and you can move the project forward. When you overwhelm yourself is when you end up in the sea of sadness with Artex and you don't know what to do because you're stuck down in it. So before we move on to measurement trees, what we want to do now is just take a moment to ask folks if there are any questions they have about the model for improvement or any questions about anything that we've gone over thus far. If you do, you can raise your hand if you're on video. We can see most of you. And if not, feel free to unmute your line or to type in the chat room. Lori and Michael, before we move on, is there anything you'd like to add while folks are coming in?
There it is.
I think the only thing I would say is keeping it small. That's the biggest point. I think that you've really honed in on, Adam, is keeping it small, keep it manageable. Think about what you need to do in order to get you to that next step. I know that a lot of people are familiar with the model for improvement in the PDSA cycle, and sometimes it's hard kind of thinking about what does that change actually look like in each of those PDSA cycles, which is what we're going to talk about next.
Absolutely. And I think I saw some people trying to futz with their phone to unmute. It's *6 and #6 to mute and unmute your phone. And I'm excited to talk about measurement trees in a moment, so I'm going to save my comments for the prez.
Sounds good. So seeing no questions, I will pull it back. And now I am super excited to pass the ball over to our partner in crime, Michael Hager, to talk about measurement trees, which is hopefully brand new information for everyone, and we'll get you all excited because it definitely tickled us in all the right places. So now I will hand it over to Michael to talk to us about step measurement.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Adam. Just so that you guys all know, this concept is something that we've struggled with for a while in quality in terms of thinking about what is the missing link between how we picture what a improvement project in a PDSA cycle attached to that improvements project would look like, and how do we make measurements. All of our measurements that we do are annualized in terms of thinking about benchmarks and other types of measurements that we use, but they're not really nimble in terms of thinking about how we can create measures for testing change ideas, particularly in our PDSA cycles. So that's what we hope to accomplish here. Next slide, please. So let me grab my pointer. I think that will help. And one of the things that is, obvious when we do improvement is that we have leading outcomes. So let's just back up for a minute in terms of what we have in BHIP. We base our standard performance measures on our outcomes. So our leading outcome would be our viral suppression outcome. It's an annualized sequential cross-section, which means we're looking at an entire year's worth of data all at once. So that's what we want to improve, what our overall viral suppression is. So when we test the change idea to see what's going on with that outcome, we're looking at processes, right? So we're adjusting these processes so that we can build up to that outcome. And our process measures that we have, we'll show you in just a minute. These are the process measures that we have for BHIP around screening, around referral, and these things obviously are the things that we do with our patients that lead to viral suppression. But the question remains, what goes into those process measures? I can talk about screening out my ears and screen this and screen that, but what goes into screening? What are the components of screening and a screening program at each of our clinics? These are what we call step measures. And the process step measures measure our PDSA cycle activities and is a way that we can think about bringing this home and bringing it to the actual tasks that we're doing day to day with our PDSA cycle testing. Let's see if I can forward the slide now. Oh, I think I need to clear my annotation first. Sorry about that. All right. I cannot advance the slides still. I'm sorry about that. Right. So the PDSA cycles is where we see our process step measures. That's where they live. So this document is from the American Society for Quality within their periodical, which is called Quality Progress. They had a article called Branching Out, and this diagram is drawn out from Branching Out. And Lori was just showing the periodical itself. Lori actually discovered this article and this concept of the measurement tree. And as Adam was saying before, Adam, Lori, and I started giggling like a bunch of school children at the table. Like, this is exactly what we've been waiting for and looking for as a way to explain this. So here you can see the pictorial representation of what I just said, where we have our, let me grab my pointer back out. We have our viral suppression measure at the very top. Then we have our process measures around screening, referral, follow-up, and then step measures, the things that go into those process measures. As you can see here in the lower right corner, these individual step measures are what we're focusing on for our PDSA cycles. And so what Adam was discussing earlier on, in terms of thinking about what goes into each of these individual parts of the process, that's what we want to focus on. So we're going to look at this in a moment and kind of bring this home for a BHIP conversation. All right, next slide, please. So here we go. So we can see these similar boxes that we were already discussing before in terms of our leading measure, our leading outcome, our process measures, and our step measures. And our patients virally suppressed are actually, that's measures 5 and 6. And what goes into measures 5 and 6, of course, is our screening. So we have screening with PHQ-9, we have screening with the TAPS tool, we have % screen with follow-up, and % diagnose. As I promised you, no lies, these are our process measures. And when you look at the process measures and the outcome measure, that's all 6 of our measures, just as Adam promised. So for the sake of argument, let's go ahead and look at what's happening if we were to do the % screen with PHQ-9. So these are things that occurred to me that are important for considering a screening program using a tool like PHQ-9. So are all the patients being screened with the same tool, or do you have renegade providers that are using another tool that just, they insist that the other tool is better and to hell with PHQ-9? the number of staff that are trained to use a PHQ-9. You can think about this one in terms of a concrete term. What is the PHQ-9? You can also think about it in an enhanced term, like what Adam was mentioning. How do I ask the questions in a way that patients feel comfortable answering me in a way that's clinically useful? The next thing, how many changes are you making to your process map? And are you updating your policies and procedures around that? That's another way that we can think about this in terms of who's doing the screening, in what order, and why. Another thing you could focus on would be the % of staff receiving customer service training. And then finally, thinking about education about the importance of behavioral health and how it affects our HIV disease. The % of staff that are educated on behavioral health importance and the % of patients that are educated on behavioral health importance. So again, I want to pull us back for just a minute because I think some of you might be saying, do I really have to do all this at the same time? And the answer is no, 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 no. We did root cause analysis and driver diagram exercises with all of you over the last several months so that we can identify what things are most important to focus on. And as we worked our way through those driver diagram and root cause analysis processes, we rank ordered as organizations. What are the things that are most important? What are the biggest gaps to be addressed? Or what are the most promising solutions that will really help us to drive improvement in our aims? So these things fall out as these individual changes. I'm going to rework my flow. That's this. That's the % of process map changes, number of process map changes. I need my staff, my full staff, to have customer service training so that we're able to meet patients where they're at emotionally, psychologically, so that we're not accidentally shutting other parts of our work down or interfering with other clinical processes. So we can think about each of these as individual PDSA cycles, and we can pursue as many of them or as few of them are as appropriate for our site based on the work that we've already done, based on the conversations we've had with our staff, based on the conversations we've had with our patients. I was at Complete Care earlier today discussing this with my friends there, and I was saying what we like in quality is process where the work starts to do itself. These things are building blocks that are so tightly fit together that basically if you do the driver diagram exercise, you've developed your step measures for the most part. You'll need a little bit more nuance and fine tuning in terms of thinking about what you're going to do specifically around that, and if there's anything else that is important to, say, screening that you might want to include. Something else that you see in the top right corner is about balance. So let's think about other intended or unintended consequences to the work that we're doing. So we can see in our step measures how it's very closely tied together that staff receiving customer service training is related to their ability to deliver the PHQ-9 effectively. But let's think about the balance side of things. We can also then, after the fact, and this is the A in the and the S as well in the PDSA cycle, what are the other things that are important to this work? So if we're making a change in the way that we're screening patients, the way that we're training staff, we can ask our patients and staff, what did this change mean for you? Are these questions being in a way that you feel comfortable answering them honestly? Ask the staff people, do you feel more effective? Are you more effective in your role? Do you feel better prepared to help your patients with these issues after this training? These are things that are really important to help us with our PDSA cycle logic as we think about whether we keep the training the same, as we scale it up and train more and more people and involve more and more patients in the screening, or do we tweak it and we start to add things, substitute things out, or change the approach that we take to our training. So a little less nebulous, I think. The next slide, I think, the next couple of slides will help us even further. So let's go to the next slide, please. So here's where we normally sit with this stuff, right? Let's be honest. Hey, I'm doing a quality improvement project on behavioral health integration. I'm going to integrate behavioral health. I'm going to use this tool. That's how I'm integrating it. And everyone's going to be trained. Hooray! I'm done with my quality work. I have an aim. I have a change idea. And I'm going to do a training and walk away. Done. Right? Next slide, please. Because while that sure is neat, what goes into the training? Who is being trained? On what timeline? What is being done to maintain the learning that happens through that training? And so we should ask ourselves, if we have an aim and a change idea and we take something off the shelf and then walk away, is that really quality improvement? It's not. Let's go to the next slide. So let's take the same kind of thinking that we used in Adam's portion of the presentation, a model for improvement, and apply it now to the measurement tree and thinking about a different slant on that same PDSA cycle. So the aim's the same, right? Adam and I had the same aim for our PDSA cycle, and that's to increase screening. For this one, we're focused on a different change step. The change step, the step measure that we're looking at is training staff on effective PHQ-9 screening tool delivery. So in this case, for the do, let's assume that we've identified an evidence-informed training material and an expert trainer. Okay, so that's something that we needed to do. We created a training plan for all the appropriate staff that includes boosters for us to think about the maintenance of this down the line, because we all know one and done doesn't really work. 3, identify key measures that we can use to track our process. So are the staff being trained? Are all the staff being trained? What's some of the feedback that they have on this training? What is some of the patient feedback that we have with this training? You can see that part of the do here and part of the plan really is to think about what are we going to be doing to track this progress. And then the last thing that we do when we're ready to implement our cycle is to test the new PHQ-9 screening tool training plan with, say, 1/2 of the team. So this is an example where the test of one, we need to be flexible so that we're not training each individual staff person individually for something that everyone's going to end up needing to know eventually. We can be lean by doing 1/2 and 1/2. So study. Meet with the team and some of the consumers to discuss their experience with this style for the delivery of the tool. Gather feedback on how to refine the training. So not only are we relying on what we had in our measure, in our do, our third item in do, identify key measures to track progress. We can track our progress, but we have this feedback now too, to have a global sense of what we're doing with this training plan. Do we just go ahead and train the rest of the staff with this, or do we make a change first and then retrain everybody? The important thing is to make sure that everybody needs to be trained the same way consistently. So if you do make changes, that's going to be something that you need to circle back and retrain the first group too. Let's go to the next slide. So basically, as I said, we would do a revised training, deliver it to additional staff. Just the way that you scale up the PDSA cycle depends on how large your organization is, and your coach can help with that. Your coach can also help in terms of thinking about whether you start with a test of one, or you start with 1/2 of your team, or what makes the most sense in your case. Because we know that each situation is different, and you might want to consider that instead of just rushing ahead. The cycles continue until there is a final training version, and at which time that we have a final training version, we put that aside and we train everyone with that final version. And lastly, I've already said this a couple times, but the maintenance and sustainability of what we do in quality is important. So whether that's a training, you need to find ways to sustain that training. If there's a policy procedure change, you need to find a way to sustain people's following that policy and procedure. So basically, what I think a good way of doing this is to consider making training or staff evaluation components around the change. So whether that's staff training or something else, to enshrine that. Because when you do that, then basically, whether it's peer review, whether it's questions as part of, end of the year employee evaluation, or some other way, you have a way to keep your fingers on the pulse of this important issue and how it's been affecting your patients.
He's in the process of getting the CDL.
Can we go to the next slide?
There's other postings that are coming up, so go ahead and tell him to apply.
So Dottie has a question. Dottie says, so the process would be, so the process would start over depending upon the turnover rate. And basically, the idea here is that if we have a training, the training is orientation plus booster. So the turnover rate applies to a training DSA only so far as you need to reorient people, or in terms of thinking about the attrition rate.
Y le dije, no, yo le voy a decir porque ustedes no van a dejarlo.
I'm sorry, we're having really terrible interference by
Porque
some.
todas la quieren saber.
Miss Harwood,
Michael,
Yeah.
you'd have to mute that because I gave you the ball. I'm so sorry. It's
Oh,
Y Harwood.
there we go. There we go. I'm like, Miss Harwood, I could do it myself, and I did. Sorry about that, and thank you. Yeah, I hope that answers the question that Dottie had, that it depends on what you're changing, and your coach can help with that in terms of thinking about how you sustain changes. Okay, great. You're welcome, Dottie. So, all right. So really what we wanted to emphasize here was a difference between what we've done in the past, coming up with an aim, having a change idea, taking something off the shelf and walking away. The actual cycles are what is quality improvement, because what we're doing is we're thinking about ways that we can maximize and accelerate the improvement that we do with the changes we make. So again, thinking about our staff training for effective delivery of PHQ-9 screening tool delivery. The training should address the circumstances that lead to inconsistent competencies in PHQ delivery. So what are the causes of inconsistency? So that's training content. How will you know when inconsistencies are addressed? Practice. You start with one staff member or half the team that deliver the screening as a subject of your training, and then have the staff member practice with their patients for that day, or half the team practice with their patients for that day. Revise the training based on, at the end of that day, based on what that staff member or half the team says, and what some of the patients who are touched by that new process have to say about it. And that's it. You start the cycle again. So you re-upped your training that has this additional insight and feedback and input. You want to think about how you can involve more staff in receiving this training, and then in doing this screening tool with their patients. So I hope that this is something that seems very simple, but I think that rooting ourselves in this simplicity will help us from going, out of control and thinking too big, like Adam was saying at the beginning of our call. Can I go to the next slide, please? So in terms of tracking progress and cycles, there are multiple ways to track progress in quality improvement projects. You can track your PDSA cycles by documenting plans and outcomes on a PDSA tracking sheet. A PDSA tracking sheet is something that IHI has examples, CQII has examples, and there are many examples. I think that you've used them before in the New Jersey Cross-Park Collaborative. Sometimes tools are very simple, and it's a page with a big P, D, S, A, and people kind of fill in a narrative. Other times tools are more sophisticated and borrow from our friends that do Lean and Six Sigma, like the A3 sheet. Teams really should be consulting with their coach on what method they would like to choose to track their own progress. But we must track our progress. If we don't track our progress, how will we know we've improved? And as we've mentioned before so many times, there's an opportunity here as individual organizations, now that the RFA has been delayed, we can take this information and have a really good sense of what we need, how we got to where we are today, how we can go further and put it in writing. Dollars, cents, numbers, figures, done. In addition, as Lori and Adam have both pointed out to us before, the state of New Jersey is on the cutting edge by funding a program like this. And we really want to be able to turn around and show our funders what their money has bought. What has this project done to improve the lives of people living with HIV, my community in New Jersey? Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to pass it back to Adam for this one.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So what we wanted to do before we move this into the discussion phase is just go over some tips and lessons learned about PDSA cycles that we've learned through all the years we've been coaching sites. And Lori's got tons of this little nuggets to guide you in the process. So we first want to remind you to prepare for multiple tests of change, right? If your plan is one test to change, your coach is going to pick on you. And we're going to have to come in and we're going to have to make more change. So be prepared that this is going to happen over and over again. For years, we have said continuous quality improvement. This is what we mean by it. Do you see now how that continually happens? So it's not just a project and over. You also want to learn from failures, challenges, and mistakes. I'm a pure science guy. I really love this process because at its core, if you go back in time, really all this is our fourth grade, how to test something, right? That's what we all learn. And what's great about it is you never fail in a scientific experiment, right? What you learn is stuff you didn't know before, and that should inform the changes you make in the future. Sometimes the projects that have failed the most spectacularly have also taught us the most about what we needed to do in the next step. So if you try something and it just tanks, we want to hear about that because sometimes it's in that crashing that you learn how to build yourself back up. The other thing that we would say is never wing it. P is for planning. My mom and I think every other sort of motherly person in the world has probably said this to you at some point, but if you fail to plan, you should plan to fail. And that is something that happens when people just run at a problem. We are always telling people, and you've heard it already in this webinar, and we'll keep saying it, slow down. Take your time. We have given you lots of time to do this. The state gave us 5 years to pull this off, right? So if you could make that change in a month, we wouldn't need this whole process. What we're doing is bigger than that. And we want to help you not only achieve the goals of BHIP, but teach you a process that will allow you to continuously improve your systems even after the BHIP project is over. We want to lift the whole system up, right? The other thing that's important is use your learning from one cycle to plan the next. They shouldn't be disconnected, right? You should connect them together. That's how they keep rolling. If you keep finding yourself getting stopped at the end of something, it's because you haven't kept the process moving forward like that. Only when you end your change idea and it's been implemented, do you then kind of feel that bump maybe to something else. The other thing that's really important is to measure your progress. Michael went over the measurement tree and step measurement today. That's a really critical step to the QI process. You have to get down into that data to be able to understand what's happening. If you don't have those measures down in that QI PDSA cycle, you're really guessing at whether this stuff is going to work or not. And you can end up spending a lot of time and effort and potentially money and resources doing something that actually didn't move the needle at all. It may have felt nice. People may have said, oh, that's great. But at the end of the day, your employees and your patients may be very satisfied, but they also may be very depressed because the project in the end didn't hit the target that you wanted it to, right? So you got to measure it to know you're hitting the right thing. Another tip, attempt something manageable and build from there. We heard lots of folks at the beginning say, wow, our EHR is just really challenging. Then maybe don't bite that off first, right? Maybe hit something else that's a little bit more changeable while you're working on your big change, right? So there should always be this idea that maybe I'm reaching for that apple that's way, way, way high up in the tree, but I know that apple may take me a year to get to because of the system around it. So in the meantime, I shouldn't just wait as I'm trying to reach for that apple. I should be looking for what's the other low-hanging stuff that's right around me that I could be doing. If I've learned how, if I've integrated my PHQ-9, let's say it's not in my EHR yet, well, maybe there's some work I could do around improving my screening while I'm getting it into my EHR. Or if you don't have a database at your site, really looking at, well, what is possible right now? If we're waiting to make that decision. We don't want people to get stuck in what can potentially become unmanageable or something that's going to take so long that you don't get the rhythm set in your project. Then it doesn't become continuous. Another thing that we would recommend is don't get stuck into the never-ending PDSA cycle. That's how Artax gets stuck in the swamp of sadness, right? And he doesn't get out. It's when people are been told we're doing a small test of change, and that small test of change becomes 4 months of their job, and they're still talking about the same thing that was supposed to happen 3 months and 3 weeks ago, right? So if you're finding that your team leader or whoever is supposed to drive the ball doesn't have the time to drive the ball, then that's when you really need to look at, am I using my QA project team lead effectively, right? Are there people on the team that need to drive this forward so that we don't end up stretching out this process so long that we lose our tech in the swamp? The other thing to think about too is that preventing your problem from happening again and fixing the problem you have now might look a little different. So when we've been in sites, what we've seen is people going, oh, great. So we're going to screen everybody with the PHQ-9. So do we call all the patients and bring them in on a Saturday and give everybody pizza and pay them to come, and then we have perfect performance, right? Wrong. That is the worst thing. Don't do that. You may fix your problem, meaning, yes, you have screened every person, but what's going to happen is your process is still the same, meaning in a year, you're going to have to probably do that thing all over again. And I can tell you that those kinds of projects, I've seen them in clinic, they can bump your performance, right? They can get you up there, give you a 20%, 30% improvement. But I guarantee you, if we come in a year, we're going to watch your curve go down. And then until you bring everybody in again, it's not going to go back up. What we want you to do is look at the system that creates those processes and prevent it, while also knowing you may need to do something different to fix the problem, right? So does that make sense to folks? Yeah? So when you look at these are just some tips of the process. And what you can do, we've got a lot of folks on the BHIP team that have a lot of experience doing this and in different ways. So if your team is having a hard time with your PDSA cycles, you reach out to your coach, right? That's what we're here to do. It's what we're here to support you in. So with that, what we'd like to do is I'm going to take the slides down now and ask folks if anyone has any questions about what we've presented, either the model for improvement or the measurement tree and step measurement for PDSA cycles. I see folks on the video. Did that make sense? Thumbs up? Awesome. I'm seeing thumbs, right? Tyson, Chris, yeah, makes sense? Awesome. Lee, thumbs up, making sense? Great. Karen, I see in the back, makes sense? Awesome. Good. So I think I've got everyone. Were there any like aha moments or revelations? Maybe we're just quality nerds and we're the ones that got super excited about step measurement. Just need to get everyone on board. Yeah, that's a great comment. And this PDSA cycle, that could be part of it, right? Like if you know that your engagement around your organization isn't as strong as you'd like it to be, PDSA cycle that, right? How do I build that stronger engagement inside my organization? Lori and Michael, any other suggestions you might have?
Yeah, one thing about that, a lot of times we do need to have our senior leader buy-in, need them at the table. But what we often forget is they need a detailed response. They need to know what you're asking of them. It's not enough just to say, hey, I need your support. Well, what does that support look like? What are you asking from the senior leader? The more direct and specific you can be to them for instance, I need to free up this team, our QI projects team, to be able to huddle once a week for 15 minutes, and I need a space to do it. So what I need from you as my supervisor or as my champion or as my senior leader, I need you to message to the rest of the team that this is okay, that this is supported, this is encouraged, and that you're going to be doing this at this time in this location. And so you can, as you think about, you know, like how do we get everybody on board if we're talking about senior leaders, be very specific because they may not know what you need to ask. When we think about other people, about how you get them on board, the other thing that I would ask is, do you have any other champions in your program that really gets behind this? Do you have people who tend to be early adopters, like the ones who the new iPhone comes out and they're one of the first people who get one, you know, something like that, or they get really excited about something like the step measurement, or something where they are a leader that other people would follow them? Pull them aside, talk with them, let them know what you're trying to do, and to see how we can use them to be the spokesperson for you, so you're not the one who's always trying to pull the people, pull our techs out of that, you know, the sea of sadness.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Lori. Those are all really great points when thinking about how you approach. That specific ask has been really successful in my experience, especially when you get to policy and procedure time, where you really got to have somebody to say yes. If you've already engaged them in the way Lori's talking about, that policy and procedure usually gets a yes really fast because they know what's going on. They've been a part of it from the beginning. Any other questions or comments?
I see some comments in the chat room about systems theory. Thanks, Dottie, for raising that. Yeah, when one part of the system changes, the entire system changes. And Pat's backing you up on that one.
I think one other comment that I would make is, if you haven't already started your PDSA cycle and you're still in that planning phase, some of this may feel very theoretical. What we would encourage you to do is take this information and try to apply it to your setting. Take that, that slide that Michael had on page, I'm looking at which one it is. Where is it? They all got out of order. This one. The one where it's talking about the outcome measure, the process measure, and it brings it down into the steps. It's slide number 25. Think about how that plays out in your program. Think about what is the process measure that you're looking at. Think about and do that brainstorming around those interventions and the change ideas that you're putting into place. Michael mentioned how you use the root cause analysis and the driver diagram to identify those change ideas that you're going to put into place. And when you do all that brainstorming, those are the things that once you identify what you're going to do, they then become the step measures. Okay, if I'm going to go ahead and, you know, do my, change my process map itself to change the flow, or if I'm going to be, you know, identifying somebody else to actually do the screening for it, what are all those elements that we're going to be putting into place? If you're going to be using, say, an iPad to go ahead and use it, all of those then lead into the step measures.
Judy asked if the slides will be pasted in Basecamp. And the answer is yes, along with the recording. And of course, you can also
have it recorded. We also, the other thing we wanted to let sites know, we've talked a lot about our training and capacity building that we've got available through our partners at Columbia University Behavioral Health. The other area that we have training and capacity building in are these types of process change. So if there's some additional training that you want related to the model for improvement, or it's a deeper dive into step measurement for your team or your site, let us know, because we have a series of trainers that can drop in and do some of that for you as well. So we wanted to make sure that we've given you resources for both the content of what we're asking you to do and the process change that we've also requested. So if any of you want that deeper dive into process change for yourself, for your team, or even if you think bringing people in to explain that to some of your leadership, those are also options that we have as well. Any other questions or comments? So we also want to remind folks that our BHIP project, as we've talked about, has its own rhythm, and we have deadlines that we've set. And I wanted to remind folks that we had said we really wanted people to initiate their first PDSA cycle by January 1. The reason we want you to do that is because come Learning Session 3, February 6th and 7th, we will be asking you to showcase all of your work, much like we did Learning Session 2. We've come up with a different way to do it that we think doesn't take as much time and is way more interactive. And where's Beatrice? Beatrice, there's a prize. There's a prize that can be won. I want to let everybody know. We've been talking about it. So what we're going to do is we thought of another way to kind of present this, but we're going to give you an opportunity to present some of your PDSA cycles. So if you have not yet gotten to this point, if you're still in the change idea place, you want to start thinking about, okay, how am I going to prioritize this and what change am I going to start thinking about? Because Lori's recommendation is actually really good, which is take one of your change ideas and try to put these ideas into it. It'll make a lot more sense. I'll tell you, we've been playing with it for a couple weeks here with our heads, and when we took it off the paper and put it into projects, is when it really started making sense.
And one of the other things to let you know, we are, I think we've got the agenda pretty close to being finalized for Learning Session 3. And we do have an opportunity to continue the dialogue around something like this measurement tree and PDSA cycles. Is that something that you guys think would be useful? Now that you've heard it here in December and you'll have a chance to talk with your coaches about it, we're going to be asking you to do something for Learning Session 3, and we'll be providing that structure. But would you guys like to have an opportunity, now that you've begun playing in this area, to have some time set aside in the agenda to really dive a little bit deeper into this? Do you think that would be useful? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Okay, I see a couple thumbs up. Okay, I got a couple.
Some way up, some in the middle. Some people are going, what is she talking about?
That's all right. We'll take you along for the ride. We'll hop on our tax.
Right. We will not leave you in the sea of sadness. All right. So what I'll do now, let me pull the slides back up 1 second. So as I had said earlier, we do evaluate these processes. So what I'm going to be placing in the chat room right now is the link to the Qualtrics evaluation form. Also located on this slide in the bottom right-hand corner is a QR code. You can, I've been told that you can simply take a photo of it with your iPhone or smartphone, and it should take you to the website. It's amazing what technology can do. If you did not register for the webinar but attended, that's totally fine. You can still complete the evaluation. We will register you in arrears, but please do complete this. Our central office will follow up with anyone that hasn't completed it yet. It is a way that we demonstrate our work to our funders. And with that, we would also, oh, wait, there it is. I'm sorry, I knew I had one more slide here. Upcoming BHIP activities. Your next performance measure report is due February 1st, 2019. We again want to thank all of the sites who submitted that first or that most recent round of data. It was our biggest data submission yet, so we're really excited. Thank you, everyone. Learning Session 3 has been scheduled. It's February 6th and 7th. A lot of folks have already registered. I know Greg has sent out the registration link, and he's also recently sent out the calendar invite. If you have not received those information and you believe that you should have, please let your coach know, or you can email Greg directly. Some folks' teams have changed a little bit, and we're trying to keep on top of who's on what team. So if we don't have you on it, Please don't take offense. It's not on purpose. We maybe just haven't updated the information since it changed last. We also want to let you know our next BHIP webinar will be January 16th. That should say 2019. Apologies, it changes. January 16th, 2019, from 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock on Zoom. And the topic there will be motivational interviewing. We've had this request come from almost all of the sites. So what we're going to do is begin addressing that by doing a broad talk in our BHIP webinar, and then dropping in with some more intensive and site-specific training in the period following that webinar based on what sites want and what's feasible for them given their staff timing and their resources. So with that, we will say thank you very much from us for taking the time out from your day. We know that you guys are very busy people, and we really appreciate it. If anyone has any questions moving forward, please reach out to your coach, and they will be in contact with us. And have a happy holiday, and we'll see you guys in January.
Thanks so much for all you do, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Enjoy.